So I thought I would do something a little bit more fun today for those of you who are of the analyst type like I am. This will also be kind of interesting for those of you who are well versed in art and are able to see things the average person can't see in art. So a lot of this stuff for you will be obvious. To some of the others who do not have the artistic ability, it may be a little bit more difficult, but what I'm going to try to do is break all this down so it is as easy for everyone to be able to see. One of the things that you may have noticed recently is that since I've been putting this information out, I've been heavily attacked, especially by this channel called True Theory. However, True Theory can't debunk anything, and in fact, by the end of this video, I'm going to be welcoming anyone to take a look at these images and perform analysis themselves. If you're going to send anybody to debunk me, please use somebody that has a higher IQ than room temperature, such as True Theory does. This person obviously can't do anything except for attack other channels and has no intelligence. Of course, the only reason to even bring him up at all is because now I believe he's made a total of 8 videos of my channel, pretty much just bitching. But let's get down to business. What you may notice on both of these images is that there's a grid overlaying on each one of them. Each one of the grids is numbered on the left side 1 through 23, and on the bottom row A through EE. The point of this is so that we can compare grid-to-grid comparisons. For example, I should be able to take a look at any single grid, for example 6J, and compare that to 6J. And what we're going to be doing is spot checking among these two images and do comparisons for analysis. Now, what I have shown you before in some of my previous videos is that there is this phenomena that Carl Jung discovered, who was a famous psychologist, friends with Sigmund Freud, and these guys, well, Carl Jung discovered something called the collective unconscious. Now, the unconscious mind is the mind that is when you go to sleep and you dream, for example. But what Carl Jung discovered is that he discovered that there is a collective unconscious, which in other words means that if we all shared the same dream, that we would all pull from the same images. And the idea basically is that a lot of the symbolism that we see in history, and we tend to see some of the same symbolism across culture, has been pulled from the shared memory location somehow. Now, what expands beyond Carl Jung and the analysis that I have been discovering myself is that Carl Jung digs primarily into general symbolism that is pulled from the collective unconscious. What differs in his work between mine is that I have discovered that more than just the general symbol, such as the mother and the child, or the Savior, is that these famous artists who were tapped in not only pulled from the general symbolism, but actually pulled from the same image that we are referring to and that seems to pop up across culture, is the Orion Nebula, and we see that in repeated instances. The reason I chose to use the creation of Adam is because I think of all of them, this one does a really good job of showing just what is happening down to some of the smallest details that we're going to see during this analysis. These memories, these latent memories that we don't recognize in the conscious world, they extend all the way back into what he even considers primordial times, so the very most ancient times. So they are somehow embedded into us, and we know about them. This digs into the whole consciousness, and the reason this work is important is because scientifically it shows that there is this ability for the human to be able to pull on information that is outside of the normal means in order to be able to gather this. For example, the Orion Nebula image that you're looking at right here is a Hubble image taken in 2006. This was cross-referenced against amateur photography as well, and anybody can go out there and take a look, and you'll see that the images are the same. The reason why the NASA one obviously is better is because once you've compared and realized that they're the same, obviously the more high-detailed version is preferable, especially when you're going to be doing analysis like this. So this image was taken in 2006. Now, to most of us, when we look up into the sky and we see Orion, what we really see when we look at the Orion Nebula is just a really faint, fuzzy star. And so there's no way that the Orion Nebula can be seen like this at all. Secondly, this painting, the creation of Adam, was actually painted in 1511. The discovery of the telescope was in 1611, 100 years down the road, later than when he painted this. And even when we did have the first telescope, the image was black and white, and really the only thing that could be seen was just a fuzzy outer layer of the Orion Nebula, and really not even that much of it. It was pretty much mostly just the bright trapezium areas that all that you could see. It wasn't until the late 1880s when we actually captured something that had a little bit of texture to it. So what I'm getting at here basically is that the people that have been pulling from the collective unconscious and seeing this imagery out here have been pulling from something that they should not have been able to being seen. They should not have been able to see it. Now, since we're dealing with a phenomena and not comparing to photographs, we have to understand that there is something going on here where people are pulling from some kind of consciousness that's beyond normal means. And so what we find is that the images that they pull from are almost impressionistic. In other words, they are not an exact photo compared to an exact photo. But during this analysis, we should be able to prove that we are looking at the same images. And I'm going to go through a procedure, or we're going to have some agreements that we can go by before we even start, so that we can make sure that we're all on the same page before we move any further. Now, as an analyst, we can take this to extreme details. What we're going to do is establish some fundamental agreements, setup, procedure, and determination for success. The first thing that we need to talk about are the agreements. We need to come to an agreement about some things. The first one, number one, what we're dealing with is pattern matching. We're not dealing with an ink blot test. And so the whole story about Jesus on a piece of toast does not fly, because what that means is that you are seeing something out of the blue without being able to compare to something if you're doing an ink blot test. What we're doing is pattern matching. It's obvious because we have two grids set up where we're comparing grid against grid. So this is not the same as an ink blot test. So that must be our first agreement, is that we are comparing two images together and not just coming up with something out of the blue. Number two, we have to be able to understand that we can actually recognize a pattern. Now, many of you will say, well, that's obvious. Obviously, we can recognize patterns. But you would be surprised how many people would say that that could be anything, or that's, but the deal is that they are not looking beyond the surface. We have to be able to establish that we can recognize a pattern. Some of the obvious analogies are, when you ask yourself, how can you recognize the difference between your car key or your house key? Surely you should be able to recognize the difference between those patterns. And therefore, if you can do that, you should be able to recognize fairly complex patterns. Another example, your favorite shirt from other shirts in your closet. How are you able to recognize them? If there are two t-shirts with the same texture, then obviously you must recognize them visually. And in order to be able to do that visually, you must be able to recognize complex patterns. So we've established number two. Now we can expand on that by taking a look at a set of clouds here. For example, we can take a look, and since the Orion Nebula is basically a cloud, it's basically complex images. We've already established that we can recognize fairly complex images, but we must be able to prove that highly complex images, such as clouds, which is really no difference than a human face, although because of the connotations that go around the face, saying that our brains are just able to recognize faces, which is not really a good analyst point of view. There's a reason why. It's nothing more different than a complex image. A face is unique, and that's the reason why we can run through millions and millions of faces and do what's called face recognition that computers can perform. But can we do that with clouds? Well, yes, we can do that with clouds. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some clouds here and pick out some clouds. And so these obviously have a certain image to them. We're going to take that and we're going to plug that into TenEye. TenEye is an application online that allows us to find the same image if it's located in its database. We see 22 results. Well, are they the same? Yes, they are the same. We see the same cloud image. And on this particular cloud image, we can see that it's not exactly the same, but because it has writing at the very top of it, which means that TenEye, and even in this particular instance, we can see that the same cloud image is the same as this one down here, but it's actually not the full image. This is important because what it means is that TenEye has the ability to segment these particular clouds and still recognize that they are the same image. This is kind of the same thing that we're going to be doing when we take a look at the creation of Adam, because we're not going to be taking a look at the whole image. We're going to be taking a look at sections of it, just like TenEye is doing here, but still recognizing that the patterns are the same. So now that we've established that, let's take a look at what some other people have said when I presented them 4 different sets of clouds. So now we're going to test the human's ability to be able to recognize pattern matching among complex images, which are clouds, which are basically the same as the Orion Nebula, since that's what it is a cloud. What you see right here are 5 different images at the top, numbered 1 through 5. On the bottom right are one of those images that have been pulled and put to the bottom right-hand corner. The test that was performed, which they were not told what it is. They just said, I just said that I have an easy test for you. I want you to be able to tell me which cloud in the upper left matches the one in the bottom right-hand corner. I did not tell them what it was for the purpose of keeping an objective point of view in the test. I wanted to remain unbiased. And so, as you see here in the list, and this was performed back on November 18th, 2012, about 99% of them, probably maybe 95%, chose the correct one, which is 4. And so what we find is that where people did make mistakes, we have one person that chose 5 right here, and we had one person that chose 2, and one person that couldn't make up their mind between 5 and 2 and 4. So why did they choose 2? Why did they choose 5? Well, if we take a look at these images, it's because relatively the colors are the same. 1 and 3 obviously have a different shade of blue besides 2, 4, and 5. Why do they choose 5 as the second most mistake? Because the texture on 2 is much different. You have a much smaller number of clouds than you do on number 5. But 95% of the people chose the correct cloud. Now I know this is a lot to go through for some of you, but for others of you who are who need to see that people can actually do this kind of thing and compare a cloud to a cloud, for the skeptics, this kind of thing is actually important, and it basically solidifies the fact that somebody is able to take a set of clouds and compare and decide which one matches. Finally, in our agreements section, I have put just a reminder that we've already discussed that a perfect replica is not needed because we're dealing with phenomena of the unconscious. So as an example, we could say that we can recognize clip art of Obama, for example, compared to a photograph of Obama, and still tell that they are both Obama, regardless of whether one is clip art or not. Regardless of whether or not, we could even take 2 photos of Obama, one with him turned to the side, one with them turned to the front. We could do this with a car. We could take something that's not a face. We could take a particular type of car that was a certain color. We could turn it to the side. We could turn it to the front. We could still tell it was the same car. So we do not have to have exact image to exact image. The human mind has the ability to be able to distinguish, and this is where we actually exceed computers, because computers, for example, in face recognition, you can only turn a face, say, so many degrees before it won't recognize it again because it doesn't have those images stored in its database. We, on the other hand, can do that, and we can do that with many things besides the face. Another example would be land masses. You can take a look at, say, the United States on a drawing of a map, or you can take a look at a satellite image of the United States. You could still tell that they're both the United States. So you do not need a photo-to-photo comparison. But what we are doing here that's different, though, is because since they are pulling it almost from an impressionistic type of art, we still have the ability to do something similar to a photo comparison, because it's almost like one image has been smudged and the other image has not been. So we can still compare doing grid-to-grid comparisons. So let's take a look. Now that we've established some of those agreements, we know what's possible for the human to do. We know that we can do this type of a comparison. It's not out of reach. And we understand that it's pattern matching and not ink blot. Let's move on. So why the Orion Nebula? Why not any other nebula in the sky? Why not the Eagle Nebula? Why not the Crab Nebula? Well, there's reasons why the Orion Nebula is important here. Number one, we have to understand that we are looking at these images that have been painted in cathedrals. So therefore, the consciousness of the people that have painted these images has something to do with a spiritual context. That's what was in their head when they painted these images. We can also take a look that the Orion constellation is probably the only constellation that we find all across culture, from the Mayans to the Egyptians. It's biblical, it's mentioned in the Bible, it's everywhere. And we know that the ancient Egyptians even modeled their pyramids after Orion. Osiris was Orion. Osiris was related to Horus. Plutarch, Isis and Osiris, back early AD, said that the soul of Horus is Orion, and we already know that Orion is associated to Osiris. We know that Horus has many, as well as Osiris, the same characteristics of Jesus and of others that we have seen, biblical saviors, or the what we call the dying God, the God that resurrected. We see this across culture. Number two is that based on the other repeatable instances that we've seen, a prediction was made that a black hole exists in the center of the Orion Nebula. The reason why this is important is because 1 year later, NASA confirmed this prediction. And that yields credibility to the fact that we did discover that there was a vortex in there, and it was later confirmed by NASA. And the reason why the black hole is important is because we also see across culture a particular creation event that happens. Ein Sof, okay, which comes from Kabbalah, is the same understanding that we see across culture, where the initial part of creation begins where let there be light, and we have this initial creation where there's nothing, and then all of a sudden there's light. And what we see is that this particular point of light, that it starts expanding, can be associated to a vortex or a black hole. We also know this because if we take a look at Buddha, if we take a look at Shiva, if we take a look at these various other images, we can go across culture and see that vortex, that Ein Sof, the point, that is the starting point of creation. And so that's why the black hole makes sense. The next reason, the trapezium is the same symbol as the eye in the triangle, which represents the same thing as Ein Sof, that point, that black hole. And what's even more significant about the trapezium is that it has been measured. and the angles of the trapezium are at 51 degrees on that triangle that surrounds that vortex. And the 51-degree slope is the same as what we see on the pyramids. The pyramids are associated to Orion. We can see how all this ties in with each other. There's many reasons why the Orion Nebula, why the Orion constellation makes sense. Could we choose another nebula out there? Well, we could go through the list of hundreds of nebulas. The problem is that not all of them are associated to ancient history. And then beyond, so we have to find a ways to eliminate some of these things. And secondly, what we will notice and what you will do in your own analysis if you go out there and compare all of these nebula is that you can't just stick anything you want to on top of another. If that were the case, 10i would have failed the test. It would have just placed any cloud out there. We've already established that a human can recognize a particular cloud. Additionally, we have things such as antediluvian art that Klaus Dona discovered, the pyramid with the eye, which is really a tetrahedron, and which is the same image that we see in the Orion Nebula. We also see the 12 cups around the one larger cup showing the Orion constellation. So there are many reasons why the Orion constellation makes sense. And then, of course, we have creation of Adam, which is actually God in his cloud. And God across culture is always associated to Ein Sof, or the point, or a black hole, or so forth. So this is why the Orion Nebula makes the most sense logically. So the next thing we want to take a look at is what have we done in order to set ourselves up for the test. First of all, in order to save a little time, what I have done is I've already lined these images up beforehand and placed the grids on there. Obviously, to run you through that process, it would take a long time. But to establish what was done to ensure integrity, both images have the exact same dimensions of 3216 by 2328. Both of the images have retained their height to width proportion. In other words, neither of the images was either stretched lengthwise or widthwise. In both instances, they have remained their original rotation and original height to width proportion. So, for example, neither of these images were the same size when I originally started, but as I shrank one and made one larger, they weren't stretched by the width or the height. They were done proportionally. That way they remained the exact same image, only changed in size in order to be able to compare one to the other. So inside these images we have a division of grids. In each one of these images we have a total of 713 grids on each image that consists of 1 through 23 and A through double E in order to be able to use for analysis. And so we have the ability to be able to test down to single grids. There are some instances where we will want to take a look at a group of grids in order to see the whole thing, or the whole image that we want to be able to see. In some cases, we'll look down to the very single grid itself. For example, her face takes up more grids than one grid. But there are other instances, so what we'll actually do is compare the same group of grids where her face is to the same group of grids that we have on this side. And there are some things where we can go all the way down to the smallest details and take a look at a grid by grid comparison, which we'll be able to see over here on God's head. But there are other places as well, but we're not going to go and compare everything on this image. We're going to do major spot checking. And what that's going to do for us is show us that proportionally that these things are located in the same areas with the same rotation, with the same size, and with the same shapes. And when we start doing the math on all of that, we'll realize that it actually becomes to astronomical numbers. So here's the procedure. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the overall pattern design. And so what that basically means is that we're going to take a look at everything as if both the images were really far away. We're not going to look at the extreme details to begin with. We want to get a general look far away to see if they relatively look the same. So here's our two images. And so we want to be able to look at them. Now, for you artists out there, you should be able to see this right away, that you can see the general, looking at them at a distance here, you can see that the lines are generally there. But for those of you who are not quite as artistic, let me show you exactly what I've done here. So for each of these images, what I have done is I have highlighted these areas on the right that you see here to show you this Vesica Pisces that exists right here, highlighted her face. None of the lines have been changed. As you can see all the texture is still there. The only thing that's happened is I have put light on this particular lines that you see right here. And then I've also done that with the creation of Adam. And I have highlighted these areas as well. If you notice, I'm putting focus on the Vesica Pisces, his arm, her face. You can see that these images, where it's actually been highlighted. And so then, what we can do is take a look at a comparison of both of them with those areas highlighted, and we can see that from a general standpoint, we're looking at the same thing. We can see that we can see the same arc that goes across. We can see the same Vesica Pisces and his leg that extends out. You can see these same images. So as a general overall look, we can say that yes, they look similar to begin with. And that's the way we do anything. When you take a look at, so if you take a look at two trees and you wanted to compare two trees, for example, the first thing you would do is you would shrink them to a relatively small size and look at their general outline or their general shape and things that stand out in them. And then as you would zoom in, then you would continue to compare all the way down until you get to the smallest details. So at a general overall look, we can see that the Vesica Pisces and the general shape of the outline here is relatively the same. Okay, so step 1B, which is pretty much the same thing, just at another level. We're going to perform a second level drill down. And what that basically means is that first what we did was just gave it a general overall look. We just glanced at it and said, yeah, they generally look the same. Now we're going to take those general things that we saw with our eyes and we're going to give them a little bit more focus. For example, we notice that God's arm comes across and touches where this boy is right here. Well, do we see the same thing on this side? And do we see the same thing on that side relative, say, to where her face is? We see that her face is in the middle of his arm. And we see the same thing generally over here. So we see the arm stretching all the way across, coming to a point, coming back down, or we can see that being this boy's arm, and we can see that her face is generally in the middle of that arm. We can also see that generally his legs stick out, and we have the same thing here happening with these lines that have been highlighted for you to see. And this dark area right here between the boy and his leg seems to represent this darker area that we see right here. And that his arm reaching out seems to represent this area right here. So that's our second level drill down. What we've basically done is we've glanced at everything at first, and then as a second level, just by doing the same basic thing, we've picked those major things apart into their sections. So we can see that the arm's in the same location, it follows the same curve, it's at the same height, her head is in the middle of the arm. All these things relatively are in the same locations as we pick them apart in our second level drill down. Now I'm just going to read to you what we're going to do on number 2, and then we're just going to go ahead and perform those tests. So after we've done that, now we're going to start zooming into grid level comparison. And what we'll look at first is we'll look at groups of grids. For example, her face would be a great place to start because her face consists of about 9 grids, I believe. And so if we take 713 divided by 9, then that number would be our ratio if we wanted to perform math, which we will do at the very end of this thing. And we can say that the odds of the face being located where it's supposed to be on the whole image would be, for example, if her face takes up 9 grids and there's 713 grids on the whole image, we would say 713 divided by 9, and we'll just call that, say, 79. So 1 out of 79 would be the odds that that face would be located where it is, because it could be located anywhere, right? In fact, it would really be 1 out of 713 because if it moved just 1 grid. So really it would be 1 out of 713 for all of these. But since we're going to compare it by group, we'll just say 1 out of, was it 79? So, so what we'll do is we'll take that number, and that'll be our first number, and then we'll find another grid. And we'll determine the odds on that, determine whether or not it matches. That number that we come out with that for the odds will be multiplied by the first number. What we end up with at the very end is all these numbers multiplied together, and we have our odds of 1 out of, and it's going to be an astronomical number that we come to. Because what we'll also be testing for is rotation. So just because we see her face located in the same location, for an example, so say her face is located in the same example right here, but say it's turned 90 degrees in rotation. Well, that doesn't match. And so therefore we have to add odds associated with rotation. Now, since there are 360 degrees in a circle, that's going to be too tight for us because it's not going to be, you wouldn't be able to see it with your eyes. So for something easy, we could say 90-degree rotation. We could just choose 4. Now what that does for us is it reduces the odds, which is not in the favor of the person doing the test, but it is in favor of an overall objectivity, because I could say, for example, that the chances of her face being located there is 1 out of 79. The chances of her face to be rotated in the same direction as this one would be, say, 1 out of 4. So we have 79 times 4, and now we have 1 out of whatever 79 times 4 is, that face would be like it is. And then, of course, we also have the size, proportional of size. See, there all these factors come into play. So not only does her face have to be in the same location, rotated in the same direction, but it also has to be the correct size in proportion to this one as well. And that number could be any number of numbers. So we really have to reduce it down to something like, yes, it's the same size, or it's smaller, or it's larger. And that gives us a 1 out of 3 chance. And then we multiply that number times the rotation times the position, and you can see how each one of these things, and then when we start doing that with all these various grids, we start coming out with numbers that are astronomical. And that's how these types of tests are done if you want to perform something analytically. Beyond just looking at it and seeing that they're the same, the math helps to understand that what we've got here is something that is way beyond the face on Mars that Hoagland came up with. There's not even a comparison to this. In fact, his is more of an inkblot test, where what we're doing here is pattern matching. So now we've established how that's going to be done, let's start doing some grid-to-grid comparisons. Okay, so I've created a spreadsheet so that we can keep track of the numbers, keep track of the pass-fail here. So as we start breaking this thing down into smaller subsections, the first thing that we want to take a look at is a smaller subgroup of the larger image. And so what we have right here is the same grids, and this is 4 through 10 and O through Z. The same grids. And what we notice about them, and we have an 8.5 multiplier. The reason why that is because we have a 12 by 7 grid, which is equal to 84 grids, and 17 divided by 84, or excuse me, 713 divided by 84 is 8.5, so we have an 8.5 ratio multiplier. The rotation is obviously the same. You could not rotate this 90 degrees and it look like that, because especially because of the arm is quite obvious. You can see that the face is pointed in the same direction and so forth. It's a pretty obvious one. So we end up with a rotation and a size. Well, is the size relatively the same? Yes, it is, because we can see that the hands in the same location, it starts at the same location, but then even more than that, we can see that the woman's face is also located in the same 9 grids that we see here, that we see here. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is where her face begins. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is where her face begins. We can go the other direction if we want to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is where the right side starts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is where the right side starts. So the sizes are the same, so we end up with a ratio multiplier of 102. Now let's take a look at the woman's face. This is a smaller subsection right here of 5 through 7 and T through V, which equals a 9-grid comparison. As we can see, the general appearance is there. We can see that her face is there. We can see where it starts over here, and we can see where her chin is, same location. We can see where her mouth is, same location. And if we want to divide this, if we wanted to divide this up into grid by grid sections, we would see that the right eye is in this grid, the left eye is in this grid, the mouth is in this grid. We can see that it's impressionistic. We can see where the major things are located, and they're all located in the proper places, as well as her forehead, the right side of her cheek, and so forth. Even the arm passing by her head is the same. So with a 9 grids, we end up with 713 divided by 9, which is equal to 79. The rotation, as you can see, could not be changed because both of her eyes would be, well, if you rotated the face, you could see that it would not work at 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 270 degrees. And therefore we have a ratio multiplier of 948. If we wanted to subdivide it up into these grid sections, we could, but we're not going to even bother with that. We're not going to go into that level of detail for her. Now we're going to take a look at God's ear. Before we even go there, let's just take a look at the group of the grids. We're not even going to use that as a multiplier, but we will use them as a means to determine whether or not we can subdivide. And by taking a look at these, we can see where the ear is located relative to where the mouth is located, that we have the same imagery going on in the lower image. So now we're subdividing into something even smaller. Here's where the ear is located, and the ear is located in the same grid as this one. Notice where the mouth is located, and it's also noticed it's at the top of that grid, just as you see right here. So you have the ear, you have the mouth, and so then when we take a look at their comparisons, we can see that the mouth is in the same location, and we can see that the ear is in the same location, and we can see even all the way down to the smallest details that the inner part of this ear is being represented. You can even see the ear lobe, you can see the ear as it goes around here. All this is important when we take a look at their relative locations to each other. And then we can even go to the length of looking at his eyebrow, which we will do next. So, with God's ear, we have 1 out of 713, and these match up. They cannot be rotated. You can see that that could not be rotated because you can see the point that it comes down to here, and you can see the point that it comes down to here, so therefore the ear could not be rotated. The same thing applies with the mouth, as we see right here. They're both located in the very top. The darker area of where his mouth is open is what this is representing here, with the lips on either side. And this could not be rotated by 90 degrees and still look like that, nor 180, nor 270. The size is relatively the same, measuring from the mouth area that we see right here. We could say maybe a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, but it's really kind of tough to tell on that. But to me it looks like it's relatively the same. The only way we'd know for sure, and really we can actually see that. We can actually go into detail. And we can see that as this comes up here, it signifies the start of the mouth, and if we go straight down, that's where the start of the mouth is. The end of the mouth is right here, We can go straight down and see that that's the end of the mouth. So the size is correct as well. So we have another multiplier regarding the mouth. So 713 times 4 rotation times the size is another 8,556. And then of course now we have the last one, which we'll just take a look at real quick. And this is God's eyebrow. Now what we'll do in order to, it's always helpful to compare against the other relative locations. We've already seen where the ear and the mouth are relative to each other. Now we have the eyebrow. And you can see that there is a line that goes across the bottom of this that represents the eyebrow, and we can see that the same thing exists right here. This is a little bit of a rougher image because there's not quite as many lines to deal with as we see in something like the ear, but we can see that it is there, and we can base that on the other relative locations of the ear and the mouth. The size is correct. We can see that there's extra emphasis right here, right above the eye. That extra emphasis exists right here. And we can even see the shading of the cheekbone is also right here as well. And therefore that gives us another multiplier of 8,556. So just with the grids that we have compared so far, a rough analysis, and by the way, it should be known too that we cannot derive a ratio multiplier for finding a particular shape in nature. For example, what are the chances that we would even find the shape that looks like the inner part of an ear, or that looks like that woman's face pointed in that direction in nature? There is no number for that, but the number would be rather low to randomly find these various things all grouped within the same image together. For example, if you were to think of 5 different random objects, throw them out on a table, what are the chances that you would find those 5 random objects in nature all located right next to each other? The chances would be very low, but there is no number for that, so we can't really add that to the equation. But when we take a look at the probability ratio to 1, we come out with 60 pentillion, 564 quadrillion, 876 trillion, 615 billion, 92 million. Well, anyways, the number is extremely large, as you can see. And so therefore, performing an analysis on this, we can see that mathematically that we have something that should be taken seriously. We have something that seems to prove the phenomena. And then finally, as a final part of the analysis, we can take both of the images and we can cycle them back and forth, and we can clearly see that what has been painted is the same thing. I hope you appreciate this detailed analysis, and for those of you that are into wanting to know the truth, then it is important to take this information and spread it around to your friends. We need to dig deeper into this phenomena. Thanks a lot. Y'all have a great day. Talk to you soon.